Democracy dies in darkness, and apparently it lives quite well in the hands of a select few pushing harder and harder to centralize power. Today, we're going to be looking at this article put out by the Washington Post about the Texas voter law that was recently stalled by the state Democrats. So you see their headline here, and here is the 5-sheet here. Let's start out with the thesis as we see it. Texas Democrats were justified in using parliamentary tactics to overcome the will of the majority because the Texas voting bill is so crazy. So that's what they're arguing here. It's not labeled an opinion piece. It's acting like this is just reporting facts. But as we go through this, you're going to see they're really arguing a point here. This is a persuasive article, and the point they're trying to persuade you on is that the Texas Democrats were justified in using the parliamentary tactics, specifically blocking a quorum, stopping a quorum, however you say it, to stall that bill from passing, because that bill was just so nuts. Alright, let's take a look at the 6th shape here. Give us a brief little visual overview of what's going on in this article. Emotionality, not too much of that going on here. Just, a little tick there. Source anonymity, not too much of it there either. Most of the sources were named. You could look it up, verify it from alternative places. Not a lot of anonymous sourcing. Opacity was pretty high. There was a fair amount of just muddled intentional confusion in there. That's a common manipulative tactic. When they're trying to hide something, they just put it buried under a bunch of gobbledygook. Irrelevancy, I rated this pretty low because I think the idea of the voter bill, these state level voter bills are pretty important to people on both sides of the aisle. Whether you believe that the elections are all perfectly perfect and always have there's never been a case of election fraud in the history of mankind, and nothing ever needs to be improved in any way because no one would even consider doing any kind of misconduct as relating to politics. Whether you're on that side of the aisle, then you think, oh, what they're doing is wrong because they're doing election misconduct by passing these laws. Or if you're on the other side of the aisle, then obviously you think the bills should be passed because they're shoring up confidence in the elections, if nothing else. Unknowability, it was kind of high, because again, this thesis, Texas Democrats were justified in using these particular tactics. It's it's sort of a complicated mess of a thing, and it's very much something that, it's an opinion thing. They're not just reporting, John Smith shot some guy at the corner of 5th and Main. That's something where, yes, we could know that happened or it didn't happen. This is something which is, they're going to be arguing, they're going to be using every tool in their arsenal to convince us that what they're claiming is true. But how true is it? Is it true at all? It's always going to be matters of gradation. How much you're willing to accept that. And finally, how much of an opinion was this? It was pretty darn high. I didn't quite rate it max, because, there was a lot of factual quoting in there. You do see more opinion-y stuff out there, but this was pretty darn high. Alright, so let's move along here. Let's just jump into the manipulation tactics. It's usually the most important part of this article. So the 3 ones they used here, out of the named manipulation tactics on the 5 sheet are intentionally confusing, strawman feigning ignorance, and poison the well. So let's start out with poison the well, just because that comes chronologically first in the article. So the first sentence is, Texas Democrats who defeated a Republican effort to pass a blah 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 blah. So that's very much partisan framing. Nobody likes to be on the losing side. Nobody likes to be defeated. Subconsciously, when it says, these guys were the defeaters, these guys were the victors, these guys are the vanquished, some part of your reptilian brain is going to push you towards siding with the victors. And so the first sentence, before they tell you anything about the facts, the context, the different arguments, one way or the other, they're saying, oh, well, they nudge your reptilian brain. These guys are the victors. And the people they're framing as the victors happen to be the ones that they side with. So that's poisoning the well. It affects the way you read the entire article that comes after it. Right, they're putting a little bit of tint on the glasses right at the very beginning there. An equally factual opening line would have been, Texas Democrats use a parliamentary maneuver to stall action on the state's voting bill, along with action on no-knock warrants and bail reform. That would have been just as true, and it would have had a very different connotation. It would have had a very different effect on the reader's minds as they read the rest of the article going forward. So it is clearly a deliberative, manipulative tactic they used. Alright, moving on. Intentionally confusing. So they had this quote here. This was the closest they came to acknowledging the elephant in the room, which, just to lay out a little context, just to make sure, not sure if I did this yet, what they did here, what the state Democrat legislators in Texas did from the Democratic Party, they at first were doing a filibuster type maneuver. It's unclear exactly what the rules are in that body in Texas, exactly what's allowed in terms of how long they can debate, how many members are required to successfully do a filibuster, to overcome a filibuster, etc. But they first intended to do something along the lines of a filibuster, and when that wasn't going to work, they did a staged walkout, where all the Democrats left to mean that there was no longer a quorum, so the legislature could not pass any bills. They couldn't take any votes or anything because there weren't enough members of that body present. So what they were doing was they were using parliamentary maneuvers because they did not have the votes to win. Right? The Republicans have more people in these bodies, so they were going to have a vote on this voter rights bill, and the Republicans had way more votes, so it was definitely going to pass. So the Democrats used these parliamentary maneuvers so that as the minority party, they were able to prevent the majority party from passing the bill. And then at the same time, after they do it, they go out and hold a press conference. Now we call on the U.S. Senate to follow in our footsteps and pass these two laws which will federalize election law, which is just bananas. It's crazy. It's unconstitutional. It's just more about solidifying power in the hands of one party. But the way they want them to do that is by eliminating the filibuster. Right? So they're saying, we want you in Congress to make it illegal to do what we just did at the state level. You have to follow our example by doing the opposite of what we just did. Not even doing the opposite, but by taking actions to make what we just did impossible to do at the senatorial level. So that is the elephant in the room. That they're holding themselves out, and Washington Post is holding them out as exemplars of what should be done to fight back against these crazy Republican voting bills, while at the same time calling for the U.S. Senate to push through these, federal voting bills by quashing the filibuster so that a simple majority can pass laws. Now, the closest they come in this article to actually acknowledging that little dissonance there, that how they're at odds with themselves, this is the closest they come to acknowledging it in the Washington Post article. It was not lost on Texas Democrats that they blocked SB 7 using a procedural rule requiring 2/3 of members to be present to vote on legislation. Much as the Democratic majority in the U.S. Senate has the power to eliminate the filibuster, a chamber tradition that is not enshrined in any law or judicial decision. The fuck does that mean? Just a bunch of nonsensical word salad. It's clear that they're talking about the topic. It's not lost on the guys that they're, they're saying one thing while doing the exact opposite. But, so, this is just a classic use of intentionally confusing, where this particular issue is what Washington Post doesn't want the reader to see. This is what's bad for them, because for all the reasons I just went through, where they use these exact tactics to push through this thing at the state level that they're calling for the federal Senate to make impossible to do at that level. So, rather than present that in a straightforward manner to the reader, they bury it in this confusing nonsense so that it's never rationally processed in the reader's mind. And so after they give you that paragraph, it's followed by a number of paragraphs. Anyway, let's find. Not lost. So that's the one we just talked about there. And then it's just followed by a number of paragraphs defending the Democrats' actions without explaining why they need to be defended. So, look, John Lewis was willing to engage in civil disobedience. State Democrats had no other choice. We know how to, and then this guy is talking about doing the filibuster, but the Republicans were going to stop it. So, they're kind of talking vaguely about the issue, but they never address it head on. The closest they do is that weird, confusing paragraph, and then a lot of, but what they did, they had to do it. It was the right thing to do. They had to do it. Well, do what exactly? It was intentionally muddled, intentionally confusing, because they don't want you to focus on that issue. Because that issue it cuts against the legitimacy of what they're doing. This has been one of the core arguments that the Democrats keep using, is we have a majority in the Senate. It's, 50-50 with the tiebreaker who is a Democrat, so that's kind of a majority. So therefore, we should be able to pass any legislation. This filibuster is undemocratic. And there's a lot of arguments against that, but that's the line they've been running with, pushing really hard. Washington Post happily helping them out. And now these state level Democrats did something that's even beyond a filibuster, where they blocked quorum from happening. And they're being applauded for doing that, while at the same time calling for the filibuster to be removed. So it's that you know, those two things not adding up. That's the real issue here, that they are bending over backwards to prevent people from thinking about. And one of the ways they do that is that intentionally confusing paragraph. Alright, next one up here is this straw man feigning ignorance. So there's that paragraph where they talk about the filibuster thing. We know how to talk for a long time when we need to. We know how to slow things down. We are determined to take that bill off the cliff because the midnight deadline would pass and no more bills could become law. So, they don't describe the exact procedure here. Whether there is something called a filibuster in that state legislative body in Texas. What did the Republicans do to end debate? Was that an unusual tactic that they did? Was it like cloture? How many legislators does it take to invoke a filibuster in that body? Right, they don't explain any of the rules there. And really, what they're not addressing here is that elephant in the room that I was talking about. So I think, this is kind of a summary of it here. The narrative seems to be that using parliamentary tactics to assert the will of your constituency, if it is at odds with the majority of elected members, is wrong, unless your position agrees with that of the uniparty. Right? Uniparty being the Democrats, the media, the big tech, and to some extent, like the institutional Republicans, the military-industrial complex, Wall Street, those guys, to whatever extent their interests overlap. So, there was some other little misleading stuff here and there throughout the article, but the main thing they did was bend over backwards to hide that inconsistency between applauding these legislators for using this quorum rule while at the same time attacking U.S. Senate Republicans for using the filibuster. So, one thing they didn't bring up was how would these rules extrapolate to the U.S. Senate? If they did kill the rule, if the Democrats do kill the filibuster, could the Republicans then just block the quorum the same way these state legislators did? It said they required 2/3 of voting members present to have a quorum. So if that's the same rule, there aren't 2/3 of senators that are Democrats. So if all the Republicans this stage walk out, could they just block everything that way? It also said that the head of the Texas, legislators could have compelled the Democrats to appear and, even send people out to arrest them if they didn't, but he chose not to do that. So if the U.S. senators did a stage walkout, could Chuck Schumer compel them to appear? None of that was answered. But I think the big takeaway here is that this is a clear example of why the uniparty is a problem. The uniparty can take opposite positions on two different contexts so long as each of them work to give them more power. They can say, no filibuster in the U.S. Senate, but yes filibuster in the Texas Senate, so long as they're voting along with the uniparty narrative. So long as those votes all accrue more power in the hands of a select few. And the media is going to bend over backwards. Media like this Washington Post article and most every other corporate media outlet is going to bend over backwards to give them cover as they're doing these blatant power grabs. And regular people are going to be self-censoring themselves on social media because you'll get canceled for having the wrong opinion. Well, you're afraid that you might get canceled. That's why you're self-censoring for having the wrong opinion on anything relating to elections. That is the obvious conclusion of where this concentration of power between the federal government, the media, and big tech has been heading, and this is just a blatant example of that. But hey, at least we still have democracy, right?